Structural design, chapter 16. So this is a provision, a chapter that covers a lot of things, and some things are going to be very consistent with what we've been doing, and then there's some new things that come in here, either, for the most case, relaxed, but for some projects, higher risk projects, a little bit stricter. So this covers everything: earthquake loads, wind loads, snow loads, ice loads. It's going to update to use the 2016 edition of ASCE 7. One thing to keep in mind about both the IBC provisions and the ASCE 7 provisions, it uses ultimate loads instead of working loads like our code today. So it might look like the numbers are going up, but they are not apples to apples numbers. They, in many cases, are going down, even though the absolute numbers are going up, because one is expressed in ultimate loads and one is expressed in working loads. Our current code is in working loads, so lower numbers, which, if expressed as ultimate loads, would be even bigger. One thing that this code does, which our current code does not do a great job of doing in the structural area, is really recognizing that there's a gradient of risk. So there is a risk classification section at the beginning of the chapter. We've modified it a little bit for Chicago, but it's saying that low risk buildings and ordinary risk buildings don't have to meet the same structural requirements as high hazard buildings that are really going to cause a problem or need to have more reliability in case of a major event: earthquake, wind, storm. So that's something new for Chicago and is going to allow us to relax the requirements on the very low end for storage structures, small residential buildings, and really only have those requirements triggered for big high-risk things, high-rise buildings, hospitals, and so on. Similarly, there's a little bit more gradation on single-family home porches, balconies that are only attached to a single unit. A while ago, when Chicago got stricter about the porch loads, it sort of went across the board. And while porches that are shared exits will continue to be 100 pounds per square foot, consistent with the model codes, those smaller porches, decks, balconies are going to be able to drop down to 60 pounds per square foot as the design live load. And then Chicago is going to adopt some seismic requirements, recognizing that we're in a relatively low seismic risk area. They are not terribly burdensome for most projects, but for the bigger projects on bad soils or risky facilities like hospital emergency rooms or facilities with hazardous chemicals, there are going to be some seismic requirements. The Chicago Code, when it's published in the book form later this year, will replace all of those maps of the country with specific Chicago values, so you won't have to look at a map of Alaska anywhere in the Chicago Building Code. Additional details have been provided for some common conditions in live load table, so some conditions about mechanical rooms and server rooms have been spelled out a little better with advice from the structural engineers who were on that advisory committee. The wind forces for small ordinary risk buildings like a single family home will be reduced approximately 20%. And there will continue to be a simplified wind force section for some ordinary conditions in Chicago, although by moving to very close to the national code, there are also a number of very good tools out there that you can use to apply ASCE provisions to projects without knowing a lot about structural engineering. Seismic design, just to go over this is something that's scary. Everyone says, oh, we're going to have seismic design and it's going to be like California. No, it's going to be like the seismic design required in Evanston or Oak Park or anywhere outside of Chicago that's already following the IBC, and in some cases a little bit adjusted. So small residential buildings, the 1 to 3 unit residential buildings, or the other sort of unclassified small residential buildings are going to be totally exempt. Just skip over seismic requirements and keep going. For project designed with prescriptive wood framing, also exempt. So the seismic redundancy is already built into those prescriptive wood framing methods. Non-occupied storage structures, also exempt. So then when you actually get into having requirements, the lowest level of requirements, seismic design classification A, really says the building has to have a continuous load path, which hopefully all of them already did. And it's not getting into reinforcing mechanical systems or bracing, anything like that. So ordinary risk buildings up to 60 feet, so all buildings up to 60 feet other than hospitals and hazardous chemical facilities are going to be in seismic design category A regardless of their soil or structural system. And based on their structural system, that exception might apply up to about 130 feet. Only on high-risk buildings, tall buildings, or soil that's really bad, and we don't have a lot of it, but we have some of it here in Chicago, will there be heightened seismic requirements, and those sort of requirements about bracing mechanical systems are only really going to be triggered when you get into those very specialized facilities, hospitals with emergency care or hazardous chemicals on site. Special inspections and tests. This is going to be an area that is going to be a little bit new for Chicago, and we're going to have to work very closely with industry to make sure this rolls out in a smooth way. So one thing that the model codes rely on and other jurisdictions rely on when there are a wider range of materials allowed, some of those materials are more complicated, more sensitive if they aren't installed correctly to creating a risk. So there is a reliance on having a little bit more, some third parties supplement departmental inspections in the construction process. So we have adopted those requirements here in some ways with some modifications. There is recognition that some small projects will not have to be subject to those requirements. Some standard materials will not have to be subject to those requirements, but for some materials, there will be these requirements, and there will be more guidance from the department, and probably another presentation like this, specifically around this for contractors to understand what our expectations are going to be around special inspections and tests as we roll this out late this year and more in 2020. Soils and foundations. This is an area where it's a good hybrid, I think, of the model code provisions and what we've been doing for a long time. So this spells out when a geotechnical investigation is required and at what point in the design process or permitting process it needs to be available, and recognizing that the way we've done it here for a long time is not the way the model code would spell it out. The model code has been amended largely to reflect how it's been done in Chicago to date. There's going to be incorporation of some things about deep foundations, which are fairly specialized, but the people who work on those were very excited that those were being folded into this code and made permanent. And then some things about foundation drainage, which again tie into plumbing and stormwater, and some of those issues will probably be revisited in phase 3 when we deal with those in depth. For geotechnical investigations, again spelling out that we're going to be different than what the model code says about how these work. There's 3 exemptions from full investigation, so single-story structures up to 2,000 square feet, storage structures up to 2,000 square feet, alterations and additions with less than 5% increase in live load or loads, and some shallow excavations can use a conservative presumptive value table. Pre-permit exemption from investigation, so that means that we will continue to allow assumed values on permit drawings as long as those are confirmed in the field before construction works begins. That's going to be the smaller buildings up to 4 stories, covering up to 16,000 square feet, and with no excavation below 8 feet called for in the drawings. Once we get into these material-specific chapters, I'm going to go through them more quickly because what I have to say about them is pretty much the same. The highlight is that we are moving to up-to-date standards for recognition of these various products. And these chapters, there wasn't a lot of Chicago-specific already in there, and there wasn't a lot of disagreement that we needed to keep something that was Chicago special. So there's a few highlights as we go through about new materials that are recognized. Structural use of shotcrete will now have code provisions spelled out. Before that would have required special requests and meetings with us to go over and understand exactly what was being requested, but now it will be spelled out in the code. Similarly for aluminum, our code today really didn't recognize aluminum at all, especially for structural uses. It will be recognized. It may or may not meet requirements for combustibility, so it may or may not be a non-combustible material, but is recognized for structural uses with those limitations. Masonry, our code today says very little about masonry and how it's supposed to be designed. There's some references to some very old reference standards The masonry industry, masons in Chicago have been asking for a long time for us to have an updated masonry code, and this will accomplish that. It will retain some of the Chicago-specific limitations from our experience from the 90s and 2000s with the poor performance of certain single-withe masonry for residential applications, so it will maintain those stricter requirements. And so Chicago has been working on updating its code for a long time and really thought it was there in the early 2000s. So as part of that, they adopted a new mechanical code and repealed some old provisions. Some of the provisions they repealed thinking that there would be a new building code in a few months were all of Chicago's provisions about masonry chimneys and fireplaces, and no one has actually filled them back in since then. So we've had about 15 years with no requirements for masonry fireplaces and chimneys and no guidance if you want to do it. So we will actually get those back in our code with this ordinance. Steel, again, recognition of the latest standards. One thing, we have a memo that we put out about 2 years ago about the use of cold formed light frame construction and some limitations around that and expectations about masonry cores, both for structural reasons and fire protection reasons. And so that will remain for buildings over 55 feet in height. And then one thing, and it's not really steel, but it got stuck in this chapter for existing conditions where there is cast iron that needs to be evaluated. Some provisions from our code today about the evaluation of existing cast iron are stuck in the back of the steel chapter. Wood, this is an area where I think there's a lot of excitement, interest about doing things with wood. This is really dealing with structural uses of wood. We're moving towards recognizing more. There are still some limitations on it. As I said earlier, Chicago has some skepticism about fire retardant treated wood in certain applications and is more restrictive on that still. We've had some bad experience with it in weather exposed conditions in Chicago and deteriorating more rapidly than it should. But we are recognizing those. Cross-laminated timber, which is popular and we hear a lot about, still is going to require case-by-case approval. So that is going to require a meeting with us to make sure that we understand what's going on with that. And hopefully in a few years that can be further relaxed as we have more experience with that. But that was one of the limitations imposed around that. There is going to be explicit recognition of some prescriptive framing methods for smaller light frame wood construction as a path to simplified structural design for some of those small end structures. That is going to be a good option. There's guidance out there around doing that in various ways from the wood industry and others. And then up-to-date standards for fire retardant treated wood. So it is recognized for some applications today. It's going to be recognized for a broader range of applications, but it's not recognized for the full range of applications that the model code would allow. So don't let the wood industry representative tell you it's allowed everywhere. There are still limitations in Chicago, but there are going to be some. So we'll work with them to try and not have them oversell that. Glass and glazing. So Chicago has been relatively silent or fairly restrictive about some of the topics in this chapter, and we are moving really towards the national standards on this. So recognition of the structural use of glass without special permission or spelling things out. Recognition of more contemporary requirements for safety glazing where it's required and what can perform as safety glazing. So there will be some additional limitations on the use of wired glass above and beyond our code today, but also some recognition of some newer safety glazing types without special permission. And then some better spelled out requirements for use of glass guards and some broader recognition of non-glass plastic-based glazing for some skylight conditions is both in this chapter and the plastic chapter. Gypsum board, gypsum panel products, and plaster. This is, again, up to date. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, up to date standards. But this one actually is older than our current code. The standard that's referenced is from 1946, and gold star to anyone who can actually find the 1946 standard on plaster use. I'm not sure anyone has a copy of that. Someone probably does. I know the department does not, so I don't know how we're enforcing it. Updated use for some structural use of gypsum panel products, probably a pretty rare application here, but there are some provisions for it. And then interior and exterior plaster and stucco applications. Plastics chapter. Actually, plastics, we have put some provisions in our code, so we're not as out of date in this area as one might have thought, especially around foam plastic insulation. We do have some requirements from 10 or 20 years ago about that, but those are carried forward in citing newer editions of the reference standards there. Some more clear provisions about plastic trim and veneer and light transmitting plastics and plastic glazing. I think that's an area where we've gotten lots of questions about. There's some strange references to it in the rehab code that exists today, but this will recognize that there are some applications where plastic for skylight use is acceptable. And then some provisions in this chapter, understandably, the fire department wanted to be more restrictive than IBC, and that is accomplished. And then, just like today, although some people don't know they exist today, there are fire limits that are defined as an area around downtown where there are stricter requirements. One area is exterior use of plastics. Will continue to have some greater restrictions within those fire limits that there's a slide later on to show where they are.